got it.
So welcome everybody to celebrating the life of Iona McGregor. My name is Jules and I work for LGBT Health and Wellbeing. And we are a Scottish charity with our HQ in Edinburgh, but we're based also in Glasgow, and we do work particularly in our helpline and telefriending service right across Scotland. And since we've been hosting events online, we're also reaching people far outside of our usual remit, which is a really wonderful thing. So thank you for joining tonight, wherever you're joining from. Please use the Zoom chat to say hi to each other. If you can keep yourselves on mute until we get to the point where we invite questions, that would be wonderful. So you've joined me and our team from LGBT Health and Wellbeing in this event, a really special event that I've been looking forward to, that we are co-hosting with the marvellous Lavender Menace Queer Books Archive. And this week alone has been a really fantastic build up to this event, because behind the scenes, there has been some really inspirational planning going on for me as somebody who is just getting to know Iona McGregor. And I want to thank Sigrid and Bob for all the work that's gone into this to get us to this point, to our panel who've been considering questions that Sigrid's put to them, and having to, I hope, enjoy the process of reflecting in order to bring you the stories we're going to be sharing tonight to celebrate Iona McGregor's life. I wanted to just let you know that the video recording will be available after the event, uploaded to the YouTube channel that LGBT Health and Wellbeing has, so you'll be able to access the event again, should you wish to kind of delve into the panel's thoughts and reflections, and share it with anybody who you know would appreciate learning more about Iona McGregor. I know that Sigrid has lots to present, but I just wanted to share with you something that Raymond and Bob shared with me today after a really interesting discussion that has been sparked by the planning for this event. And that is that the language of the time will sometimes help us to understand the distance we have travelled since then. And I think as we reflect tonight on Iona McGregor's life, we can learn so much about where we are, where we've come from, and all that's happened in between. And it's just such a pleasure to be part of it. So I will hand over to Sigrid, sit in the background and do my technical best to accompany what's in store. Thank you, Sigrid.
Thank you so much for your technical best, Jules. And more than that, because putting this together has been a labor of love, to be honest. The reason for that is that both Bob Orr and I, who founded Lavender Menace Bookshop in 1982, knew Iona. She was one of our strongest supporters. And as you'll see, as we unfold her story, she was very deeply involved in supporting the LGBT community in Edinburgh. And 3 years ago, Bob and I came back together to found Lavender Menace Queer Books Archive in order to focus on the books and writers that we featured in the bookshop. It was the first LGBT bookshop in Scotland at the time. And we want those writers to be remembered and linked to the queer creativity of today. Iona was one of the best known of the queer writers of the time, particularly in Scotland, because of course she lived here and had lived most of her life here. She and Ellen Galford were two of Scotland's earliest lesbian novelists. And she was passionate and knowledgeable about Scotland's history. She set most of her novels in Scotland, where she lived during much of her life. And she was also a teacher and an LGBT activist. She sadly died last year in March 2021, and we're holding this online event to celebrate her life and work. And these are excerpts from an interview with her, which was published in 1993 by Bob Cant, editor of Footsteps and Witnesses, Lesbian and Gay Life Stories from Scotland. Some of you may remember our last event, which was about his work. and it's going to be read to you by Debbie Cannon. She's been in many plays, and she's written 2 of her own, Green Knight and The Remarkable Deliverances of Alice Thornton. And we've put her website up in the chat if you would like to know more about her. Debbie and I are going to tell her story. I'll read some of the narration, and then Iona can speak in her own words. So we'll start with Iona's birth.
I was born in 1929. It should have happened in Fife. I was a premature baby, and I was born in England, near Aldershot. My mother was an army schoolmistress, and my father in the Army Education Corps. He was an instructor at Queen Victoria School, which is a military establishment. It was quite a rough place. We lived in the grounds of the school, and I was surrounded by tough little boys.
Iona realized at an early age that she was different from other girls.
I wanted to be a boy, and I was attracted to my female contemporaries from the age of about 8. These erotic feelings towards my contemporaries bothered me a great deal. I did feel desperately that I was a freak. I went to Bristol University, where I studied for a degree in combined honours, in my case, languages and English, and I had semi-affairs, which became quite passionate with 2 of my fellow students.
After university, Iona taught in York, and then she moved to Edinburgh, where she worked at the School of Scottish Studies. She was always interested in the Scots language, and what she learned later appeared in her novels.
During the 50s, most of my friends were gay men. Those were the days of camp. Great fun. I also had some older women friends who were willing to give me advice. It was always, go to London. You'll never get anywhere in Edinburgh.
Iona took a teaching job in London. Still isolated, she went looking for the notorious Gateways pub, made famous by the film The Killing of Sister George in 1968.
If only I'd known at the end of the 50s that gay people met in the Lion's Tea House, my life might have been entirely different. I heard about the Gateways, but I turned back at the door. I hadn't the nerve to ring the bell. I actually did make my way inside it later on, but I only touched on the fringes of the gay scene, although gay was not a word in use then. Until the middle 60s, unisex dressing was unheard of. Women didn't wear trousers except for sport or riding. At the Gateways, femmes wore frilly dresses and bouffant hairstyles, and the butches sported suits, ties, and brill-creamed hair. Some of them would be holding down jobs as secretaries and wearing skirts and stockings in their working lives. The butch-femme divide was rigidly adhered to in the 50s. You had to be one or the other. 2 butches couldn't get together, nor could 2 femmes. I don't know what I would have done if I'd managed to get into that world. In their terms, I was androgynous.
Later, Iona said that she met an ex-girlfriend of the Prince of Monaco who loved the Gateways, the girlfriend, not the prince, and that they had had a fling. Meanwhile, she found a teaching job in Kent, and it was there that she met the woman she called her true love. They were together for 12 years, but both were teachers, and the stress of the need for absolute secrecy, as well as hostility from her lover's family, led to the end of their relationship.
Towards the end of the 60s, the scene in London was beginning to open up for women. There was a magazine called Arena 3, which later turned into a monthly, Sappho, run by Jackie Forster. At the same time, my lover and I moved to Edinburgh, but our relationship ended a few years later. I don't know whether she succumbed to unforgiving family pressure. The social climate was so hostile and dismissive. You need to have lived through that time to understand the effects of it.
But one effect was that Iona, after her partner left, began to volunteer at the Scottish Minorities Group, later known as the Scottish Homosexual Rights Group. She helped to start the first lesbian groups in Glasgow and aided in setting up the Women's Group and the Befriending Service in Edinburgh. She welcomed visitors to the Edinburgh Gay Centre, including me, under her own name, though it put her job at serious risk. Iona assumed that one of the people in her first groups who was wearing a miniskirt was a man, though we don't know how they actually identified. The conversation about gender, started by trans people themselves, hadn't gone far in those days, and there was very little general awareness, even among those who were working for change.
We started out as 4 women and a man in a miniskirt meeting in a Roman Catholic presbytery. We drew in women from all parts of Scotland and produced a newsletter called the Gazette. Throughout the 70s and most of the 80s, the fight was to establish the right of lesbians and gays to an open lifestyle. We've suffered some reverses, but much more is possible now. And there's also a recognition that as many varieties of homosexuality exist as of heterosexuality. I'm in my 60s now and still involved in the sense that I speak at meetings and write to the BBC when I see anything that smacks of homophobia. But these days, I devote more time to writing novels.
Iona began writing young adult historical novels in 1965. She wrote 5 YA novels, all but one set in Scotland: The Popinjay, An Edinburgh Reel, The Burning Hill, The Tree of Liberty, and The Snake and the Olive. She was very private about her writing, and many of her reviews were in the 1960s and 70s, and they've never been digitized, so that means they're much harder to get a hold of. These are some excerpts from reviews of her young adult novels from the 60s and 70s.
The Popinjay, a notable story set in Scotland in 1546. The living sense of time is brought home with intense reality. The weather, the food, poverty, climate, work, illness, and wounds, the hazard of being a human in desperately unprotected days. An Edinburgh Reel. The key to this story is the young heroine discovering herself and 18th century Edinburgh at the same time. Christine and her father lodge in a flat in the Lawn Market, where they enjoy the fine, muddled democracy of city life. Christine going to the playhouse, reluctantly witnessing a cockfight, picnicking on the wintry sands of Leith, enduring and enjoying the pangs of first love, is a wholly delightful creation. The Times Literary Supplement, 1968. The Burning Hill. Iona McGregor is irresistible on 18th century Scotland. She writes with such gaiety and verve that the voices of her characters flirt, bicker, quarrel, and make love right out of the printed page. It is a real joy to come upon a book that is so full of wit, charm, and above all, life. The Guardian, 1970.
And the next one was Death Wore A Diadem. which was set in Edinburgh in 1860. It follows a rebellious schoolgirl, Christabel, her lover, who is also her tutor, Eleanor, and a huge cast of characters, including the real-life detective James McCleavy and the Empress Eugénie of France. It also featured a lady who rented rooms by the hour in Rose Street. This is a review by Megan Casey, an American writer, on her blog, The Art of the Lesbian Mystery Novel.
This is a rather delicious book that deserves way more attention and reviews than it has garnered so far. Its publication date, 1989, shows it to be far ahead of its time. The relationship between Christabel and Eleanor is very believable and touching. We believe in their love for each other and are rooting for them all the way. The intricacies of their girls' school are well set up, as are the plot and resolution of the mystery. Give this book a thumbs up with every hand you have.
Rosie Mack, a PhD student from the University of Texas who wrote about Death Wore A Diadem, described it in an article as
a heady combination of a thoroughly researched historical novel, a comedy of manners, a melodrama, a lesbian romance, and a cozy crime whodunit.
Iona also wrote another mystery novel, Alice in Shadow Time, published in 1992, essays on Scottish history, commissioned by the National Museums of Scotland, an article in the first collection of Scott's LGBT writing, And Thus Will I Freely Sing, entitled Visibility, 80s Rising, and a series of study guides. All her works are now out of print. We hope that this won't be the case for much longer. And we'd like to share a few more excerpts from her novels with you.
An Edinburgh Reel, 1968. Christine sang to herself as she walked down the street. She sang as loudly as she wished, for the words were drowned in the noise of the crowd that swarmed between the tall grey building of the Royal Mile. 6 stories above her head, the washing flapped on the poles like ragged banners and seemed to be breathing out the rhythm of her song. The tradesmen's signs creaked in the wind, and the women screamed down their orders to the coalmen and fishwives. The evil smells that poured out of the narrow closes and stairways had sickened her when she arrived in Edinburgh 2 days before. Now she was too happy to mind the stench. The words of the song danced off her tongue, and she laughed when 2 sedan porters made her step into the gutter. Today, nothing could upset her. Her father was coming home. 6 years ago, he had gone away to Perth to meet the Prince's army. It would be a short campaign, he said. The few months had lengthened into 6 years. For a moment, the song died on her lips as she remembered the terrible days after the battle. There had been no harvest that year. In June, the English soldiers had marched up the glen to burn all the crops and every house they could see. Her father's house, Tulmore, went up in flames, and Strathdallan House had made a fine blaze as the soldiers rolled the butts of claret away on sledges. The first winter had been the worst of all. She lived with Lady Strathdallan, the chief's widow, in the ruins of her house where the charred rafters of the upper floor groaned and swayed in every gust of wind. Now the acts of amnesty and grace had been passed, and the exiled Jacobites could return home, and she had been sent to Edinburgh to meet him. She had never been out of Strathdallan before, and she had been terrified. But she pressed her father's letter in her pocket to drive away the black memories. Let them fly away like the scuds of cloud that raced over the narrow slit of blue sky above the Royal Mile. At the inn at the foot of the Canongate, where the coaches arrived, stable boys and caddies, the odd job men of Edinburgh, ran in and out. The coach from Leith was late, said the impatient travellers. Christine laughed at their annoyance. She remembered her father when he departed for exile 6 years ago, a magnificent figure, proud and gaudy as a cock in his checkered tartan. The crofters called him Red John because of his hair, the same red as her own. But it was now treason to wear the Highland dress, and she must look for him in the French uniform he had once sketched for her in a letter, a blue coat with a French officer's sword and a hat festooned with gold lace. There was a piercing blast on a horn, and 3 horses drawing a black and yellow coach clattered into the yard. The passengers clambered out stiffly. A clergyman in a fuzzy bob wig, a fat woman who panted as she slid her hooped gown through the door, a young officer in scarlet, and 3 or 4 other men. She could not see her father. Tears of disappointment stung Christine's eyes. She had been so sure he would come. Cold fear gripped her. What if he never came at all? But that was nonsense. Her father never broke his word. Then she noticed one man who did not seem to know where to go. He was quite short and small and stooped a little. He wore a green coat, short cut in the French fashion, and a dark wig. Underneath, his hair showed grizzled and sandy. He had no sword, only a small cane. As he came near her, she saw he had a distorted, elderly likeness to her father. "Christine," said the man diffidently, "are you my child? Christine?" She nodded, horrified. It was hard not to back away. Then his arms clutched her so tightly that she cried out what sounded like a greeting. His glance wavered over her, surprised and uncertain, while Christine struggled with her dismay. The more she looked at him, the more bewildered and shocked she felt. Death Wore a Diadem, 1989. The affair of the false Grecian diadem, which occurred during the Empress Eugenie's visit to Edinburgh, is one of the most carefully suppressed scandals of that discreet and respectable city. Those most directly affected were Christabel, her lover, 2 teachers at the Scottish Institute for the Education of the Daughters of Gentlefolk, and 1 dead servant maid. Events began when the York Express steamed in at 8 o'clock on the evening of Saturday, 17th November, 1860. For several hours, the platform below Waverley Bridge had been seething with a crowd that stamped frozen feet, pulled out silver flasks from muffs or frock coat pockets, and surged forward whenever a train pulled in. Eugenie's flight from Paris had baffled the public journals. She was travelling incognita. In London, the manager of Claridge's had panicked when he realised that the Comtesse de Pierrefonds, one of 5 French aristocrats who had booked into his hotel, was in fact the Empress of France. South of the Tweed, however, most of the world was unimpressed by the Empress's visit. It marvelled that someone prostrated by the death of her beloved sister should seek recovery at the wintry knuckle end of Europe instead of joining other invalids in fashionable Nice. Moray Place lay on the western side of Edinburgh's new town. Its circular facade was massively porticoed and pillared, and 4 short streets broke the circumference like the icing on a hot cross bun. It was mainly occupied by judges, university professors, and fashionable physicians. There was also an Episcopalian sisterhood whose doleful chanting was much disliked by the other residents. For the past 25 years, numbers 9 and 10 had been taken up by the Scottish Institute for the Education of Daughters of Gentlefolk, shortened by its pupils to Sindog. 6 hours before Eugenie's arrival in Edinburgh, the front door of the Institute opened and let out one of the senior pupils, Christabel Mackenzie. She took the exit road that led into Church Lane. This was a narrow mews street running between coach houses down towards Stockbridge, an area on the fringe of the new town. She strode down the lane with a release of stifled energy. Today was her 17th birthday, and she was going to meet her beloved. Meanwhile, her biology tutor, the student governess Eleanor Stewart, was waiting at her home in Claremont Street. When Christabel had started at the Scottish Institute, her knowledge of biology, it was found, would have disgraced a child of 3. Eleanor was assigned to help her make up her deficiencies. The two enjoyed their lessons, but months later, Christabel was still stupidly muddled as to the details of leaf, flower, and seed case. Eleanor blamed herself at first, but after questioning one of the full-time governesses and discovering that Christabel had a remarkable ability to memorize facts, she became suspicious and decided to set Christabel a small trap over the cone collection in the Museum of the Botanic Garden. Orcaria, Pinus, Cedrus, Larix. Translate, please. I'm afraid I can't, said Christabel. Eleanor was annoyed. Christabel was taking up her limited free time. You are a sham and a humbug. You know more Latin than I do. Surely you don't want these lessons to be prolonged into the summer. Oh, yes, I do. What beautiful brown eyes you have, Eleanor. Eleanor is too long. I'm going to call you Lena. I love you, Lena. Eleanor did indeed have beautiful eyes. Their lively, confident expression was rather at odds with her quiet personality. At first glance, she seemed on the plump side. This was the result of her sturdy build. It was also contradictory that she should give the impression of being shorter than she actually was. But there were many aspects of Eleanor that were misleading to a superficial glance. She was nonplussed at Christabel's remark. Though she was used to being pursued by homesick little girls, when they brought her flowers and sweets, she gave them a motherly pat on the head. She could not bring herself to take up the English habit of kissing, and distributed the offerings amongst their friends. But this was very different. It is hard to feel motherly towards a self-possessed young woman taller than yourself who leans across a glass case and smiles at you boldly. Eleanor said, I think we should go outside and look at some trees. and she kept them walking around the southern conifers in a state of exhilarated panic until a burst of rain drove them indoors to the newly completed section of the Palm House. Later, Eleanor decided that it must have been the drugging warmth of the atmosphere which had paralyzed her. She found that her arms were around Christabel's waist. Christabel pulled Eleanor towards her and kissed her passionately on the lips.
And I think we'd better leave them there. Thank you very much, Debbie. We're going to go to a 5-minute break now. And when we're back, we'll introduce our panel who will tell us more about Iona and her writing.
So just take 3 to 5 minutes, everybody. You can switch your screens off, replenish hot drinks, and we'll be back shortly.
Why am I not muted?
I'll start. I hope everyone had a good break. I'm now going to introduce our panel. We have Jen Green, who was Iona's editor at the Women's Press between 1987 and 1989. She edited another book now in our archive, Dispatches from the Frontiers of the Female Mind. It's a science fiction collection. And she also edited one that you may be likely to remember, because I certainly remember it being in the shop. It was called Reader, I Murdered Him, and it was a crime collection. We don't have this one in the archive. If anybody has one that's just taking up space, we would love to hear from you. And the Women's Press published all of these, and it was one of the independent LGBT and feminist publishers who made it possible for us to open Lavender Menace Bookshop. And Jen, meanwhile, became a full-time writer in 1996, and she was a Royal Literary Fund Fellow at the University of Sussex. We also have Ellen Galford, who was born in America, but has lived in Scotland with a few years in London since the 1970s. A lesbian novelist who was originally published by Sturmillion, Scotland's first feminist publisher, and later by the Women's Press and Virago Press. And she's also worked in children's publishing and on the Remember When project, which recorded LGBT community history. And our third panel member is Marceline Cameron. She was born in Scotland, but is now based in London. She's a writer and editor who wrote on Broadcasting for Gay News and in many other publications, including In Other Words, which was a collection of papers about feminist writing, which grew out of a conference organized by Lavender Menace Bookshop. That was back in 1987. And thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate your sharing your memories of Iona, of working with her and being her friend. And so I'll ask Jen my first question. You knew Iona as her editor. How did you come to work with her, and what was it like to edit the scenes Debbie has just read from Death, Wore A Diadem? What was it like to edit those with her?
Okay, so I was an editor at the Women's Press, and I'd started a crime list, the first feminist crime list, I think, in this country, certainly. And Iona had actually approached a colleague with a young adult book, but she'd also mentioned that she'd written this crime novel, and was I interested? Obviously was very interested. We read it as a submission, and I was very interested in it. It was unlike anything that I'd written, unlike anything I'd published before, because the other crime books were contemporary. And here was a historical crime novel set in Edinburgh in 1860. So it was really, really different, but really wanted to do it. But there were certain aspects of the novel that actually we worked on very hard over the next 2 years. Actually took 2 years, from 1987 to 1989, to actually bring this novel to fruition. After Iona had done one rewrite, we decided to publish, but I actually, we had some other another major rewrite, and then actually I made her cut the novel by a third. Rosie Mack, who is here today, hello Rosie, is writing her dissertation on the Women's Press, and has actually uncovered, believe it or not, 100 pages of correspondence between the Women's Press and Iona, and it's mostly editorial discussion about really trying to make Death, Wore A Diadem the very best book it could be. We changed the title, we did sort of reduce it, and we bought out certain aspects of it. This was obviously before the days of email. Iona was in Edinburgh, I was in London. So all this correspondence takes place, by letter and telephone call. But, a lot of it is still extant, which is absolutely amazing. And I think and hope, if nobody else contradicts me, that Iona enjoyed working with an editor who cared as much about her novel as, well, almost as she did. And
thank you very much. I don't know, she never mentioned how she felt about the editing, but she felt very pleased with the novel as it emerged and happy to be able to launch it. She launched it at West and Wild Bookshop in 1989. I think that she was probably waiting all her life or for a large number of years to write this novel. And so, Ellen, how did you meet Iona, and how long did you know her, and what was it like being her friend and working in the same field in children's publishing?
Well, I would say we worked in the same field, but in the mid-70s, I didn't actually meet Iona, except maybe we were briefly introduced. I was just desperate to meet Iona. I was relatively new to Scotland. I was also relatively very much new to trying to figure out how to be a lesbian and how to be a Scot. I'd only been here for about 4 or 5 years. I was working for a very douce Scottish publishing house called Blackie's. And there used to be these sort of children's book fairs and book events where various publishers and writers and booksellers and actual school kids and school teachers would all gather together. It's like a sort of mini Frankfurt book fair, only with very tiny chairs. And Iona was probably there doing a reading of, I would imagine, one of her historical novels for a group of kids. And I knew she was going to be there because I had friends. I was in Glasgow. I had friends in Edinburgh. The Scottish lesbian scene at that point, it was fairly, there were a lot of contacts between people. I mean, it was a kind of small world within worlds. And so I knew here was this lesbian who was also a kind of, a well-reputed, well-known children's author, very serious, or I think YA it would be called now for, and so I was kind of thinking, oh, I really want to meet her. How can I sort of, send her a secret signal or something to say, I'm connected in some way to you. But I was particularly fascinated because she was a proper lesbian grown-up. She was, a generation or so older than I was, or, certainly, I count it. And she was not part of all the dodgy stereotypes that a lot of us had to fight against in those days as to, well, I'm not like that. How can I, where do I fit into this lesbian world? But she was somebody who just, for me, was quite a sort of glamorous role model in a way. I don't know if Iona would ever have seen herself as glamorous would have been the adjective, but she was glamorous to me. And I was just dying to talk to her. And maybe at that book fair, somebody introduced us. I might have, hello, I'm from Blackie's, and, so on and so forth, blah, blah, blah. And I was just, how can I kind of connect? But I don't think we actually really got to know each other for another few years at least, until I'd been living in Glasgow, moved back to Edinburgh where I'd been before. And I think it was either be at somebody's house for dinner or at a party, possibly held by somebody who I think is maybe in the night. And there would have been, or some kind of political event. I mean, it was certainly probably before Lavender Menace, but by the end of the 70s and early 80s, there was so much going on. So I still can't now remember, when did we act, what was the point when that, sort of ideal, mysterious, rather exotic figure just sort of evolved into my friend. I would say certainly by the time we'd been down to London, come back again in the late 80s, Iona was a friend, somebody to be spotted walking along the Pentland Hills with the Lily Dots lesbian walking group. She'd, on her way up West Kip, but she'd stop and have a chat, and she was very much part of the same world I felt very much part of by the, in the 80s and the 90s, which was both, there were different ways to connect with lesbian life in Edinburgh, and yet nobody was that many degrees of separation away.
Thank you, Ellen. And Marceline, you wrote a tribute to Iona in the Guardian's obituary, especially about her many and varied lives. And can you say something about what it was like to be her friend?
Yes, indeed. First of all, if it's all right, I shall pick out something that Ellen said, because I think the idea of how you appear and glamour and so on, that was of great interest to Iona, I think. And she would not have turned that down as unworthy of her attention. And good friends of hers who are probably joining just now, will remember that in her later years, she was in a care home. We would visit, we would go through, of all glamorous things, the Daymart catalogue and choose what to have. And she was very discriminating about that, as always. And she said, amusingly, when we'd gone through and made an order, she said, "So I think the effect I'm looking for is restrained magnificence." So that's a new look for Daymart, I think. So, however, Iona was the first organised lesbian that I met. I met her in 1973, and I had responded to a discreet advertisement by SNG advertising women's meetings, and you had to write to a post restaurant address, which I did, which was quite exciting in itself. I'd never written to a post restaurant before. And I got a letter back from someone who signed themselves Chris Campbell, and a careful but, you know, warmish letter, and saying, well, yes, we do have meetings, that's correct. If you really want to come to one, then I will meet you at John Menzies' bookstall in Waverley Station at such and such a time and such a day, and then I'll take you to the meeting. So it all felt, you know, quite like a spy story, really. I was kind of laughing about it. But of course I went, and we had some difficulty finding each other. We eventually found each other. And then there was a car with a driver who was silent. And we got into the car, and Chris Campbell said to me, "Now, my real name isn't Chris Campbell, and you don't have to give your real name if you don't want to. People understand." So this was too much for me. I explained to Iona, as it turned out she was, that my name was rather difficult, Gaelic, and it's taken me a long time to learn it, and I couldn't possibly learn another at this late stage in life. So, and basically we were friends from that evening for nearly 50 years. We had, it was a big age difference. I was 22 at the time, she was 44. But we had a lot in common, and one thing was a classical education, because like many gay people these years ago, classical Greece in particular was the one place where you could see respected relationships between people of the same sex, so people tended to turn to the classics for that reason. At that time, this early 70s, of course, the world was about to change for gay people in very substantial ways, mostly positive, of course, but change of that magnitude at that speed presented huge problems for people who had adapted themselves to living, you know, a life that suited them. You know, despite the prevailing icy winds, and Lord knows the winds in Edinburgh were icy. So Iona and I, over the years, we would talk a lot and laugh quite a lot about, you could see we and others taking on new identities, trying to think what it's supposed to be, but old patterns kind of seeping through all the time. Well, that made for quite a lot of amusement, really. Iona, she was someone who prized loyalty very much, both in herself and in others. And she never shrank from asking hard questions, again, of herself and of others, as, for example, who do you owe loyalty to, and why, and how should a person like you behave? And what about the seemingly intractable gaps between intention, desire, and action? How do you cope with these gaps? do you revert to lies and silence, or do you begin to explore what truth and courage might mean for you in your particular circumstances? And I think you've, in the extracts read earlier, I think you can get a sense of how these hard questions with no easy answers emerge in the novels and are addressed in the novels.
Thank you very much, Marceline. I'd like to come back now to Jen and mention Rosie Mack, who you mentioned before and who's here tonight or today from your point of view. She wrote an article about Death, Wore A Diadem for activisthistory.com, and I recommend that everyone look it up. It's a fascinating article about the novel as it appears from the point of view of today. And she read your correspondence with Iona about the novel. She says she was impressed with the work both of you did to portray lesbian relationships, not just positively and in an engaging way, but credibly, based on what we know about women's relationships at that time. What did you feel was the value of that kind of accuracy? Do you feel now that Iona was right to argue that her heroines could have conducted their relationship without causing suspicion and a scandal?
I'll just unmute myself.
Right, yes.
Okay, so obviously the novel hinges on a relationship, a lesbian relationship between a schoolgirl who's 17 and her a governess at the school who's 22. And you know, I think that this is a tricky dynamic, you know, in any age really. It's tricky, very tricky dynamics today, but we're talking about a novel that's set in the 1860s. So one of the things that I discussed with Iona at great length was whether this lesbian relationship would have been visible to anybody at the time, really. So Iona makes it quite clear that it wasn't just a romantic friendship, although of course it was romantic, but it was also sexual. And in fact, her protagonist, Christabel, is attracted to other women as well. And again, you know, that she's making an important point there. And our discussion took place in the context of the Woods-Peary trial. The Woods-Peary were two governesses who set up a school for young gentlefolk in Edinburgh, and they had a number of pupils. And in 1811, the matron, the grandmother of one of the pupils, basically reported that her granddaughter, a schoolgirl, had overheard or in fact seen, made it clear that the relationship between the two schoolmistresses was a sexual one. And thereupon there was a great big scandal, and everybody removed their children from the school. And Woods and Peary sued the grandmother for defamation. And the case was heard by 7 judges. And finally, the judges ruled by a narrow majority, actually. They upheld Woods and Peary that had been defamation, really on the grounds that it wasn't credible, that they could have been, that 2 women would have had a sexual relationship. So in other words, really siding with Queen Victoria, that sexual relations between women just wasn't something that could be thinkable. So there's 2 characters within the novel who we were concerned might suss that Eleanor and Christabel were having a sexual relationship, and whether one of them is the villainous headmistress. And had she realized that their relationship was sexual, she would certainly have expelled Christabel in ignominy. And in fact, in the novel, it does cross her mind at one point that, oh, that's, could this be possible? And like the judges and like Queen Victoria, she dismisses it, that it couldn't be possible. So that was one of the interesting discussions that we had. But obviously, really, one of the whole charms of the novel for Iona, for myself, and I think for most readers, is that this is a full-blown sexual relationship happening in 1860, 50 years after this Woods Prairie trial. And it's got to be there. It's essential to the whole novel. And in fact, in answer to the question you asked earlier, I didn't actually edit the sex scenes at all. I just thought they were perfect as they were.
Thank you very much, Jen. And Ellen, you wrote 4 lesbian novels around the same time as Iona published Death Wore A Diadem, Moll Cutpurse, Her True History, The Fires of Bride, Queendom Come, and The Dyke and the Dybbuk. And like Iona's novel, they are comedies, though unlike her novel, they're about myth and fantasy. Do you feel that, like Iona, you were working to create a new kind of queer story, which wrote us as central figures on a larger stage than we dared to claim before? And would you say it's important for us to write our true histories?
Okay, big double yes to both. I think it was a time when one of the excitements for us as things, well, I don't know whether things opened up or everybody was just sort of tearing away the kind of the screens, taking the gags off culturally. There was a lot of energy, and I think for me it was dyke hunting through time and space and different cultures. And it was, in a way, I don't think Iona would have perhaps used that phrase, maybe, but I think we both, I'm sure, shared that sense of mission. It was just kind of a given. We felt we were, I think, both part of something that, you'd seen there had been more resources and more activity in the States. You'll know as a bookseller that you probably had things impounded by customs because they were coming over with dreaded gay themes in them, And Iona was a very proper scholar. She was a classicist, she was historically trained, and she was really a fine researcher. The work she did for things like the publications on Scottish life later, that material. She really did show her mettle in Death Wore A Diadem. You got that wonderful combination of absolute scrupulous research, but worn lightly and elegantly, and that sense of drama and fun. But you could have footnoted it. It would have been reliable. I'm not nearly so intellectually disciplined. I really went off in anarchic directions where you don't have to follow any rules. You just kind of make them up. But I think for both of us, it was very much that fight against enforced invisibility, against all the sort of toxic cultural stereotypes. When you had in pop culture, any lesbian you saw in a movie was often as an extra. They were not only sinister, but they were sometimes disabled. They had sinister sticks to walk with, and they were scary, and they were sadistic, and they were doomed. Or you got a certain amount of high culture license, like in ancient Greece with Sappho. And I remember my mother and I having this kind of not screaming, we didn't scream, but the kind of the agonized arguments in the early days of my struggling to come out to her. And she said, I know it's been going on since Sappho, but I just don't like it. The notion of two women together. And but so you had, it was kosher for Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, friends of Picasso. So you did have this, this notion that there were some places in culture where lesbians could perhaps be or have been. But we both understood that it was not, lesbian identity, both for ourselves and our characters, was not going to necessarily be to anybody's fame and fortune. And that's not why I think we did it. But you know, Iona especially, because she was an established writer of what would now be called young A, you know, sort of young adult fiction, you know, and she had been a teacher in a very prestigious Edinburgh posh school. She would have known she was taking a lot of risks, and you know, just for her personal well-being and her career, it wouldn't just be disapproving glances. And I know she had been, I think, in fact, you know, somebody else may have talked about this, you know, there'd been, if she had even thought of creating characters that were other than, you know, straight down the line, white bread, heterosexual, you know, it was not going to be a good thing for her or her career as either, you know, in any way. And I know I had a different angle of the same experience when I finally was introduced to an agent, a proper literary agent, and who supposedly had a good reputation. Oh yeah, she's very pro-women. You know, another feminist writer said, oh yeah, you should, you know, talk to her, show her your book. And I remember her reading it and saying, well, I think it would do better if it just doesn't have very many interesting male characters. It doesn't have many male characters at all. Don't you think you could put in maybe more men? And kind of somehow she was not the person who ultimately, when I ever worked with an agent, but it wasn't with her. But then there's suddenly, to get, you know, there were publishers like Women's Press who were very much, you felt suddenly, well, not suddenly, but you know, they were on our side. And like Virago, who kind of, although they were feminist publishers, I think eventually came round to it. They had, the first time I had sent them all cut purse before Stromolian, who were friends of mine, you know, valiantly published it. And I think they sort of maybe weren't ready for it at that point. Later, when they did publish other stuff of mine, and you know, I think by that time, and said, you know, we really should have said them all. But the important, there was one, you know, but in the early stages, there weren't necessarily, there may well have been lesbians at Virago, but it was only later that there were some crucial people. I'm sure Jen probably knows, you know, who I mean, you know, that were very, you know, it became more comfortable for them, at least at that period. But, you know, it was a long time before, you know, if you weren't going to be either high art or very, 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 very low art, as it were, there was not going to be any place for you. And this was the period when suddenly there was. And so, you know, I think Iona and I'm not sure we ever sat down and had a conversation about it, but it was definitely something we were both singing from the same Lavender hymn sheet.
Thank you very much, Ellen. And Marceline, you've said that friendship was central to Iona's life and that it was important to her because of the isolation forced on many queer people in those days. You've also mentioned that you put it this way, you said despite, or perhaps because of the dangers and having to use names like Chris Campbell, some of you who came together in those days remained lifelong friends. Do you think that this has relevance for queer people today? And is Iona's reaching out to other queer people at great risk, both in her fiction and in real life, an example which can still inspire us, even though we don't face the same stigma as they did then?
Such an interesting question, Sigrid. And yes, this whole idea of friendship and this, which had to be a portmanteau word before there were civil partners and then marriages, friendship had to cover everything basically. And so what did it mean? And gay people would work out different codes. What kind of friend is this? Your friend, what's that? So terribly interesting in terms of language. I think in terms of how things were at the time, I think in the early 1970s, this pivotal time, in the lesbian groups that I knew then as a young woman, many of the existing members of these groups had had a really hard time. They had had really hard times. And they assumed that this would also be true for the young people coming after them. And their reaction was so admirable, I think, looking back now, because they were very kind very kind to us young ones coming, very tolerant and kind. They also gave gentle pointers on how you might avoid the catastrophic consequences of what seemed at the time going against, you know, the basic social order of marriage and all the different gender relations. And so they were trying to help you live a life but not be an outcast. So I think for me, the kindness, absolutely, who, you know, for the future, who couldn't do without kindness? That is a lasting legacy from them. I think the gentle pointers have gone the way of history. But another thing I think about the relevance of friendship, and thinking about it in Iona's life and work too, is that, I mean, for many of us, one of the pleasures of gay life has been its explosion of boundaries, of age, of nationality, of gender. One could class. One could go on. That actually you met people that you would not have met before, and they became very significant people to you. So strong friendships were made across these broken down boundaries. And that was something that you could take a lot from as well. So questions of, forced on you really, questions of identity, who are you? And of values, what kind of life do you want to live? The fact that these could take very different forms in different eras, and one thinks about Iona and the historical novels, but always they would demand answers that made lasting sense to you, that you couldn't just take a template and that was going to work. And looking ahead again and thinking, you use that interesting word, inspiration. What I think about Iona and her life and work, and along with her peers, and I'm thinking in particular here of Ruth Shrug, who was absolutely fundamental in setting up Scottish Minorities Group for Women, a marvelous and very courageous woman. So I think they showed the need to use will, imagination, nous, charm, whatever resources were at hand, to work with others, to create community, whether on a large scale or a small scale, that will be resilient and flexible and that will offer protection and support. On an individual level, and of course, that's where friendship is grounded, the magic ingredient has to be trust, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And Iona chose friends to look out for her in the later vulnerable years. And here's to you, Ruth and Hilary and May. And guess what? We turned to each other, and I hope that we found together the strength needed to be worthy of that trust that she placed in us.
Thank you, Marceline. I think you've answered the question in a way I didn't really anticipate when I wrote it, which is that finding friends was hard then. It's probably easier now, though I wouldn't like to speak for young people, but making a community isn't any easier. It still takes that magic, and it still takes that trust. And you've got to look into yourself and look outwardly to other people in order to create that trust. So I would also like to thank Sylvia Neary and Veronica Harkins, who were the people, the ones in the women's group who welcomed me, and that led to a lot of things, including this meeting. So we're running out of time now, but I'd just like to ask briefly if any of you have any questions you would like to ask each other.
Okay. One of the things, could I ask Marceline a question, as somebody who had been a young lesbian in Scotland and then ultimately left? The time you talk about was still, you know, when you first met Iona, was a time when it was Scotland, Edinburgh particularly, a place people ran away from to be able to live a life. You know, you go off to London, or there'd be these vast diasporas for those with the resources. They'd wind up in San Francisco or who knows where. But, you know, so some people left and some people stayed. And it was just trying to, you know, get you to sort of reflect on that. Iona was one of the people, well, she went away, but then she came back. And that sense of place and how it changed. I mean, what your feelings were, who went and who came back and why or why not?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question, Ellen. I think from thinking about Iona's position, I mean, Iona was so interesting because, as we've said throughout the evening, she was passionately devoted to Scotland, to Scottish history, to Scottish literature. But Iona was an internationalist. Absolutely, there was nothing narrow about her interests at all. And her family background was, you know, the whole of, she was Miss UK, really. She had the whole lot was behind her. So she had a very broad interest, and in the different nations of the UK as well as further abroad. And I think for me, I was brought up in the Highlands and then we went to Edinburgh. I wanted to see something else, really. And as you say, it was Edinburgh at the time was, it was pretty ghastly, really. I mean, it was a patriarchy. That was what was so difficult. And I worked in publishing then, in medical publishing. It was just, I mean, there were nice human beings, but you just, I can't live with this. You know, it had to be broken out from, I think. And I think, you know, like Iona had already had a lot of experience by that time, and she had a rich inner life. You know, she had a lot to go with, but I had a lot to learn, I think. Whether I ever learned it is another question.
Anybody else?
Hi, I'd just like to say that like Sigrid, I was incredibly indebted to Iona McGregor and Sylvia Neary for the befriending that they did in the early 80s when I was trying to find out who the hell I was. And although I didn't know Iona, I knew of her and found out more later. She was one of the people who helped me find my way in life, and I just wanted to reflect that. Also, I was one of the people in Stramullion who did the paste up of Moll Cutpurse back in the day. that was such fun back then, because
and a beautiful book. I think the Stramullion edition was really gorgeous.
It really was, and I use the illustration whenever I can.
Yeah.
Sigrid, I think Mary has her name up, hand up, or did have.
Right. Go ahead. Can you get through all right?
Can I speak? Is that okay?
Yes.
I just want to say massive thank you to you all. This is the first time in conversation that I have heard such a positive use of the word lesbian. It's been really, really lovely to hear from you guys. I mean, it's just gladdened my heart. I just wanted to say, as a young lesbian and who's also disabled, it just has disability. It's just so lovely to hear that word lesbian is used in such a wonderful positive context. I think that was the first time I've heard that word used in a long time in such a positive context. So thank you so much, because you're all awesome, and I'm just so happy. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. It's moving to hear that. Is there anyone else who'd like to ask a question? Well, if there's no one and you can be thinking about it, I will ask one, which is, Iona's books were once taught in schools, and you're going to see video clips when this discussion ends of some of her readers who were teenagers when they discovered her due to school. And I would like to ask the panel if you think that would be beneficial today. And there's now an obligation for schools to teach about LGBT people and history in Scotland. And do you think Iona's young people's books, or Death Wore A Diadem for that matter, I sure would have liked to have read it in school, would that be a good way to illustrate both queer and Scottish history?
Right. Well, can I say definitely yes, but also that we're at a very scary time again, because if you look elsewhere in the world, places like, the state of Florida has been trying to impose things which are like the old Clause 28 days. There's a lot of pulling back going on. So if you can get through, if you can do that, I mean, we may have to fight again for things we thought we'd already gained forever. And so I think, the more opportunities to teach and to share and to give people a sense of history and a sense of connection with the way it was and how it is now, to get the conversation between generations sustained is absolutely going to be crucial to everybody's survival. Anyway, that's my sermon for the moment.
No, I absolutely agree with what Ellen was saying there. And I think it's not often that one lives through times of such rapid and extreme change. And so for young people now to think that, well, this woman was a lesbian, she was a lesbian all her life, but in her novels for young adults, she can't express any of that, and she has to do a bit of the old heterosexual whatnot. That's really weird. So I think it's trying to think, how do these things make sense? It's such rapid change. How can you explain what that was like, how that could be, what it was like to live like that, where you didn't have anything like the choices, because when you're growing up, the choices that are available seem to you, that's the natural range of choice. But of course it isn't. And so, it's one way to learn about history for sure, what can be changed and what can't, And a very good example of things that seem utterly, basically to do with nature and couldn't be changed. And yet in our lifetime, they have been changed. So I think it's, it's very deeply significant, really.
And what would you say, Jen?
Yeah, it'd certainly be fantastic if they were on the curriculum. Brilliant.
Well, I'll read you the statement from Time for Inclusive Education, which is a body that's been set up because this is now a legal requirement, and they are working on making it happen. And they said, we believe that within the context of LGBT inclusive education, that the writings of LGBT authors should play their role. The literature used within the curriculum should be as diverse as the curriculum itself, and a reflection of the young people who learn from it. It's important that young LGBT people see themselves reflected in their education, and representative literature can provide an engaging vehicle in which so to do. And I hope that they're going to listen to this conversation, I certainly will be sending them the link, hoping they'll think about Iona's works. And in the meantime, I hope all of you will reach out and maybe ask for her books in the library if you're interested in reading them, or just talk to people about them. And one of the things I've been doing is on Twitter and Instagram, making her name into a hashtag, hashtag Iona McGregor. And if you have any occasion to do that, seize any excuse and post about her and use the hashtag so we can get it going all over the world. And any other questions? This is your moment, do it.
Not a question, but I want to highlight a comment in the chat that Hayley said, how she put, I love how open and affirming this whole conversation has been, especially with reflecting on lesbian authorship from a modern standpoint. So I just thought I'd highlight that comment that she made because it was really cool.
Well, thank you so much. I think it was really cool too. And it's, we, Lavender Menace Queer Books Archive, are here to facilitate that kind of conversation. We're here to connect the writing of Iona's time with the amazing creativity that's coming forward now, and get everybody talking together. And I'll just tell you that we are, you can go to our website, lavendermenace.org.uk. We're selling cards by Kate Charlesworth, which are portraits of queer writers of the past. And you can order them on the website. You can also become part of our Become a Menace campaign and donate in order to make it possible for us to hold other events and to reach out to different writers and researchers in order to celebrate Scottish history and get it actually written down, where it won't just kind of fade into a story that nobody has any exact knowledge about. So you can also access our other 4 events on our website. And this is the point where I announce that we have now actually found space for the archive at the Edinburgh Palette in London Road. And we will be having exhibitions, and we will be welcoming visitors to see the collection of books and hopefully add to it. And I will have more to say that on our social media and on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And thank you all so much for being here. I'm glad people have made so many comments affirming that this kind of conversation is something that's important to you, and that it's working to build the kind of community that Marceline was talking about, and that Iona took a lot of risks in her life to help build. If we can keep walking along that road now, that's certainly what I'm in it for. So thank you. And Jules, I'll hand it back to you for the final clips and pictures.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Sigrid. Oh, there's so much going through my mind. And I'll close things up in just a moment, but I hope you'll allow me just a moment for this little advert that I'm posting into the Zoom chat, which is about our age action group. If you're 50 plus, we need you. So I'm not going to share my screen because it'll all get too confusing. But Keith, my colleague, would love to hear from you if you're interested in getting involved in the age action group. And I think if Iona were here, I think she would. So we're looking for active members to participate in the group and represent the interests of the older LGBT plus community across Scotland. The time and commitment to attend 8 meetings per year, in person and online, plus smaller group work, and your help in ensuring that we are listened to by decision makers, service providers and other age organisations. And Keith Patterson is the person you should contact, keith@lgbthealth.org.uk, and you can reflect on those words in the Zoom chat just now. I have a video to share just before we finish, which is 4 minutes long. I'm aware we have gone over time tonight, but I think you'll think it's worth it. It's been such a privilege listening to the panel. And honestly, this week, when I sat in on the planning meeting, the kind of run-through meeting, I came away feeling so sparked with intrigue and questions, but ultimately just filled with pride for the people like Iona, who have come before and have paved a much safer and more liberated way for myself and people I know in the community too. So I feel so grateful, is how I feel. Somebody put that in the Zoom chat, and I feel the same. I feel very grateful for this conversation, for working with Sigrid and Bob and Lavender Menace, and it's great to hear that the Queer Archive is developing in terms of moving to a space, and it needs your support. So hop onto their website and help where you can. I'm going to share the film, and I will come back to the main screen to say goodbye. But Sigrid, if there's anything else you need to add, do let me know. I just want to thank everybody for coming and for taking the time out tonight, but mostly to thank the panel and Sigrid for putting this all together and for introducing Iona in a really thorough way for me tonight, but also in a way that leaves me wanting more.
She would like that.
What was it understated magnificence? Something like that?
Restrained magnificence.
Restrained magnificence. I like that. I'm not sure I'm as restrained as that, but that's brilliant. Okay, so this is a really poignant film. It's a collection of video clips that's 4 minutes long, and I think you'll enjoy it. Oh dear. Let's try again. Just bear with me. Our best with Zoom, but it's a strange old beast. Here we go. Share screen. Yes, I do want to share my screen. I do want to see this. Iona's friends and readers.
This is number 60 Broughton Street. It used to be the door to the Edinburgh Gay Centre. 45 years ago, I opened this door for the first time. I had never been to any lesbian or gay
Come back.
organization before, because where I lived, there weren't any. So what was it like to go in that door for the first time? Just to give you an idea of what it was like for many people, you could see people looking up and down the street sometimes to make sure that no one noticed them before they went in the door. I opened the door and I met Iona McGregor. We had a long chat about lesbian life and a nice cup of tea. After that, I joined the women's group. I made friends myself, and my lesbian life was never the same.
So I first read The Tree of Liberty in primary school as part of a project we were doing on 18th century Scotland. When I moved to Edinburgh, I wanted to read it again, so I tracked it down from a rare bookshop online so that I could read it with a bit more geographical knowledge in my head, being able to see the streets in my mind, and it was just really lovely to read it again.
Sorry, folks. It's sticking and I'm not sure why. Let's see if I can bring it up in the same place.
project we were doing on 18th century Scotland. When I moved to Edinburgh, I wanted to read it again, so I tracked it down from a rare bookshop online so that I could read it with a bit more geographical knowledge in my head, being able to see the streets in my mind, and it was just really lovely to read it again. And a character that I related so well to, Caro, she was a sort of lass being pushed into a box that she didn't feel fitted her, and it was wonderful. I enjoyed it again so much I managed to track down a second copy as a gift for my twin brother, who'd also loved it as a child.
We read Tree of Liberty when we were in primary 7 as part of a school reading project. Our teacher, Mr. Clark, was very fond of Edinburgh and Edinburgh history and would passionately lead many projects in that direction. Now, before reading The Tree of Liberty, my knowledge of Edinburgh was based on the yearly Christmas trip that my mum's work would organise, and we would all get on the bus and we would come down to see the big shops. We'd have a look around the British Home Store, we'd have a special tea somewhere, and then we'd pile into the Playhouse and watch Cinderella or something, and then pile back into the bus to come up the road again. Then I read The Tree of Liberty, and Edinburgh became something entirely different. All of a sudden, I had an understanding of Edinburgh as this wonderfully gritty, historic place, and it was full of adventure, and it was dangerous, and the characters in The Tree of Liberty really brought Edinburgh to life for me.
I first got to know Iona in 1973 when we were both members of the Scottish Minorities Group in Edinburgh. We worked together writing a report on social work practices and homosexuality. Iona was meticulous in her research, and I learned a lot from her as a young student. Iona always made her presence felt at meetings, and wasn't slow in coming forward when she thought sexism needed to be called out. We all knew her then as Chris Campbell. Most of us were closeted at work, including Iona, who was a teacher. It says so much about her and her involvement in SMG, despite her chances of being sacked.
That's so wonderful. I very much enjoy being left with that image. I hope you do too. Thank you so much, everybody. It is a bit later, but sometimes these things are just worth bearing with the technology to get to the crux of why we're hosting this, which is about people. And like it was mentioned earlier on, it's about trust and building community, and it takes kind of contributions to do that from people. And I thank you again for the panel and to Sigrid. I'm taking away magic. Magic is a word that stood out for me. And I'm quite keen to do some dyke hunting, actually, which is also a phrase that I've never used before, but I will from now on. I particularly like it when Ellen talks about it.
Believe me, we're going to do more.
Good, I'm in no doubt. I'll post the feedback link again so you can grab that before you go, because it would be really, really good to get your feedback about tonight. I'll take the comments from the Zoom chat, and I'll thank our volunteers for working hard in the background and everybody who's contributed to this event, and I hope there'll be many more. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
We'll just let you drift off, as I always do at the end of our events, just drift off as you need.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Say goodbye to folks, say goodbye in the Zoom chat. We'll just let you go at your own pace. But if you're too long, we will boot you out. The feedback link, folks. I urge you to visit. Thanks for contributing some feedback in the Zoom tech chat as well. I will go back and read it all. Thank you, Debbie. Beautifully read tonight. You really brought everything to life.
Yes.
That was really, that was special to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for letting me read Iona's words. Obviously, someone who's so special to you. That really feels like an honor for me, actually. Thank you so much.
Good, good. A well-earned rest you've enjoyed.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's been fantastic being part of it.
Yeah.
Have a
Marceline,
great weekend.
it was just super hearing you talk about Iona from a friendship point of view. And actually, there's so much that transpires into my life about that, about the importance of friendship. So I shall think on that for a while. Thank you, Pat. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Mary. Thank you for your comments. They meant a lot.
And I'm fascinated to see there's a comment here from Libby to say, I'd like you to know gay kids are still very into the classics.
Yeah, I saw that. Well, just this, kind of shows you, doesn't it, that we're still so desperate for the representation.
Yes, indeed. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, Pat, hello.
Can I just ask you, you said about the Zoom chat, for somebody who's totally illiterate, how do I join this Zoom chat or whatever it was you were inviting us to join?
Oh, right. You have to find the button that says chat. It depends. Are you looking on a PC?
Yeah, on a laptop, yeah.
I'm just going to stop the recording because nobody needs to hear this. Bye.